Okay, everyone, I think we will get started if we may. We may have a few latecomers joining us, but welcome everyone on what is in Geneva a hot summer's day. Welcome to our webinar on assessing the nuclear risk reduction agenda. My name is Renata Dewan, and I'm the director of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. And we're really delighted to have so many people join us, particularly from widely around the world, on this critical topic for a discussion today. It's one of the few benefits of this difficult and challenging time that we have, that we're bringing more people virtually together from a broader regions and areas than we might otherwise. So let me just flag, this event will be 75 minutes long and it is being recorded. And you, of course, my colleagues John and Wilfred and others will walk you through questions and answers, but we very much hope you'll join us and the panel for the discussions. So on to the topic today of nuclear risk reduction. It is in itself not a new issue. In fact, when I think back on UNIDIR, the very first publication ever issued by UNIDIR in 1982 was entitled Risks of Unintentional Nuclear War. So as we celebrate our 40th anniversary this year, often there's a sense of, are we in a déjà vu type situation and scenario? So what is behind this increased interest in this topic? That it's been, as you know, a critical topic in the current review cycle of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty review process. Its strategic risk reduction has been identified as an issue for discussion among the P5. The UN Secretary General's agenda for disarmament in 2018 set out proposals for action on nuclear risk reduction. And it's been a theme of a number of state-led initiatives, including the United States creating the environment for nuclear disarmament discussions, as well as the Stockholm Initiative led by Switzerland and Germany. So it's very much the theme of the day to a huge extent. And what does this tell us? Well, in no small measure, it's a reflection of the current strategic environment. As well as, I think, an assumption that nuclear risk reduction could be an area of potential cooperation and therefore risk as well as opportunity. We see, I think, in the arms control community, heightened policymaker, expert, and public concerns about the risks of use of nuclear environment, reflecting a deteriorating environment. Many of you have already put some of those issues up on the question, the warm-up question that's been asked. Sort of issues that include tense relations between nuclear armed states, increasing numbers of nuclear armed states, many of which have embarked on nuclear modernization programs. We have the erosion of arms control and disarmament frameworks, and equally important, dialogue between states. And then there's an increased uncertainty, and I saw that some of you put that on the question, uncertainty linked to including technological developments and new strategic unpredictability. So I think one of the reasons that nuclear risk reduction has occupied so much attention over the last 2 to 3 years is because perhaps there's a sense that it can be an area, one of the few areas of common interest of states, that whether you're nuclear or non-nuclear armed state, there is a shared interest to reduce to a minimum the possibility of any nuclear weapon detonation, whether intentional or accidental. And I think there's also a perception which very much comes through in the Secretary General's agenda for disarmament, that the pursuit of nuclear risk reduction might also be a pathway to help reinvigorate arms control and the process and the search and the pursuit for nuclear disarmament. So the motivations for interest in the topic are different and multiple. But I think the question that we're hoping to explore today with you is, how do we translate growing support for the risk reduction agenda into concrete practical action? And to do that, we have a great panel with us today, many of whom have been working with us over the past year to analyze specific regional contexts and regional risk pathways, as well as practical measures that could be taken to reduce those risks. That work has been recently published in a UNIDIR volume, Closing Pathways to Risk, which you can access and download on the UNIDIR website, together with a number of other publications addressing the issue of reducing the risk of use of nuclear weapons. I'd like to give a shout out to the governments of Australia, Finland, Sweden, and Switzerland who've supported us in this important work. But let me move on to the panelists, the much more important topics today. I'm delighted to be joined by Ulrich Kuhn, Head of Arms Control and Emerging Technologies Program at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy in the University of Hamburg. Ulrich, welcome today. Also, Manpreet Sethi, who is the Distinguished Fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies in Delhi, India, and leads the Center's program on nuclear security. And Manpreet should ordinarily have been a visiting fellow with us these months in UNIDIR, but obviously COVID has delayed that. So Manpreet, great that you're joining us, even if virtually. And then our very own Wilfried Wan, who leads UNIDIR's work on risk and is the contributing editor to the volume, but who's also done really fantastic work for us in helping us explore and work through these themes over the last 18 months. But before we move on to the panelists, can I just welcome, she needs no introduction, many of you already know her, Izumi Nakamitsu, UN Secretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. And I think under Izumi's leadership, ODA has really championed efforts and helped lead this discussion, global discussion on how do we think about risk reduction, how do we prioritize it, and then how do we identify practical ways to advance on it. So it's my great pleasure to invite Izumi to make some opening remarks to help set the scene for the panel discussion, and then we'll move straight away into the panel discussions ably led by my colleague John Bory, head of our WMD program. So Izumi, over to you and welcome as always.
Thank you, Renata. Thank you so much for these kind words. I think UNIDIR has really developed into a very, very important institution under your leadership. And it is always such a pleasure to participate in UNIDIR's really thought-provoking events. And I'm sure this is going to be one of them. As an independent authority on all things disarmament related, UNIDIR, of course, continues to bring very fresh perspectives to the most pressing arms control in international security issues of the day. And I think there are indeed many pressing issues today around us. Now, the report being discussed today, Nuclear Risk Reduction, Closing Pathways to Use, is really no exception. It's a comprehensive analysis that takes a holistic approach to risk reduction. Understanding that, of course, concept means very different things to different people, states, and regions. It also takes into account the spectrum of factors influencing nuclear risk reduction in the 21st century, including the transformative technological developments that have taken place in recent years. I have consistently noted that the COVID-19 pandemic is teaching the world many important lessons. And one of the most important, I think, is that globally disruptive and really previously unthinkable events with devastating consequences can happen indeed suddenly. We must remember that this also applies to the potential use of nuclear weapons, either intentionally by accident or probably more likely through miscalculation. The current level of nuclear risk is unacceptable. Anyone who has even glanced at the media in recent months will be aware of this. Eroding relationships between nuclear armed states, coupled with bellicose rhetoric, qualitative and in some cases quantitative also, improvements to nuclear arsenals and the disintegration, unfortunately, of the nuclear arms control regime have placed us in a very precarious position. It is a position that has not appeared overnight, but rather one that has been coagulating for years and catalyzed probably by events during the current pandemic. Over 2 years ago, if you recall, in his agenda for disarmament, the Secretary General called for nuclear risk reduction measures to be pursued with a new sense of urgency, and stressed that such measures should enhance stability and increase security for all. Of course, as UNIDIR report rightly concludes, the only way to eliminate this risk by nuclear weapons is to eliminate nuclear weapons themselves. However, it is clear that while the world needs to return to path of complete, irreversible, and verifiable nuclear disarmament, the current moment also requires agreed implementation of measures that will reduce the risk of misperception and miscalculation and reinforce the norm of non-use. Any use of nuclear weapons will be a catastrophe with ramifications for the entire global community. So I would say that it corresponds that the entire international community has a stake in ensuring that such a catastrophe never occurs. Although it is not a perfect vessel, for example, several nuclear-armed states remain outside its parameters, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or NPT, remains the best instrument through which to discuss these concerns and to develop possible solutions. And the best forum in which to have a robust dialogue and find agreement on common understandings about risk and how to reduce it remains the 10th NPT Review Conference. Now, the pandemic-induced postponement of the review conference, tentatively to next year, January 2021, was indeed disappointing. However, there now exists an opportunity, I would say, to use this hiatus to narrow divergences and amplify convergence in positions, which, as we all know, currently are very divided. I have argued that in addition to other elements, such as strengthened implementation of existing commitments and reaffirmation of a norm against use, a package of risk reduction measures should be an integral part of any review conference outcome. States parties should use the next 6 months to try and reach agreement on how risk reduction can be addressed by the conference and what a possible outcome might look like. Despite different perceptions about risk reduction measures, including the view that some actually increase risk, many NPT states parties see this issue as not only potential for common ground, but as a pressing priority and a near-term contribution they can make to shoring up international stability. There are some growing areas of commonality, many of them reflected in UNIDIR's report. A broad range in nature of what constitutes risk reduction can, in this context, also be seen as an asset. I believe the review conference could look at 3 broad sets of risk reduction measures. Now, I should caveat definitely that this is not a non-exhaustive list, and many more could be included. Chief amongst these is the need for greater transparency and understanding through enhanced dialogue and engagement. This is indeed amongst nuclear-armed states, between nuclear-armed states and non-nuclear weapon states, and should extend beyond diplomatic encounters to technical experts, military-to-military interactions, I think very important, and of course between leaders wherever possible. Dialogue could pertain to a spectrum of issues ranging from doctrine and numbers to deployment and testing of new weapon systems. But the aim will be to remove misperceptions and decrease chances of miscalculation. Enhanced engagement could also consider how existing or now defunct confidence-building measures developed during the Cold War could be revitalized. A second set of measures could relate to crisis communications, how to lower temperatures in the midst of potential conflict. Effective mechanisms and platforms for ensuring communication in a crisis should be examined in order to develop methods that can be utilized in today's multipolar and multi-regional nuclear landscape. Finally, nuclear risks posed by new technologies, weapons with strategic capability must be discussed to better improve transparency and understanding. This includes how offensive cyber capabilities could affect nuclear command and control, concerns about abilities of artificial intelligence to deepfake early warning sensors, and the potential for miscalculation created by so-called hypersonic weapons. Risk reductions in this field could include political declarations not to interfere with command and control structures or methods that clearly define whether a weapon is intended for conventional or nuclear purposes, or even agreements to refrain from deploying destabilizing weapons. Each of these measures would help reduce the risk of nuclear weapon use, but also in helping to mend trust and confidence, open the door for lasting disarmament measures, I hope. As I said, the postponement of the review conference should be treated as an opportunity. Between now and whenever it is held, states parties have the chance to lay the foundations for success. Developing successful risk reduction strategies could be a key to that success. One final word, perhaps the most beneficial course of action all states parties can take at this moment is to exercise restraint in both action and words. This will not only help facilitate an environment conducive to real dialogue and therefore success at the review conference, but also, and more importantly, I would say, reduce the dangers that nuclear weapons pose to all of us. I thank you very much for listening, and I'm very much looking forward to the panelist discussions. Thank you, Renata. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Izumi, for that, and for, I think, highlighting the centrality of the MPT, which, as you described as, in your view, is the best forum for discussions on nuclear risk reduction. I think that will be an interesting topic for discussion. I think the other suggestions you make about what might represent a package of nuclear risk reduction also gets at the heart of a key theme in our work, which is nuclear risk reduction, and risk reduction more generally is at its heart a subjective activity and based on perceptions and security of the countries and regions that are distinct and different. So looking at a package that goes across a range of interests, and you flagged transparency, crisis communications, and dialogue addressing new technologies with strategic implications and capabilities. And then thanks for the reminder on reducing and restraint in actions and in words. Let me also just thank Nicholas Plattner for reminding me that I do get my S's mixed up all the time, and the Stockholm Initiative is indeed a Swedish-German initiative, not a Swiss-German initiative. It's proof of my affection for my host country and my previous host country, Sweden, that I get them mixed up all the time. But thank you very much, Izumi, and we'll move over now to the panel, and I'll hand over to my colleague, John.
Well, thanks very much, Renata. I'm going to moderate. What's going to follow is going to be a discussion in which we won't have presentations, but we'll sort of start off with a bit of a guided discussion with our panelists, and then we'll move into a phase where we take questions from you, the audience. So how is this going to work? Well, what we'll do is after 2 rounds of questions for the panelists from me, we'll take some questions that have been submitted by you in text via the chat function in WebEx. Now, how does that work? If you move your mouse again, you'll see the row of round icons toward the bottom of your screen. And if you click again on the more options circle with the 3 breadcrumbs, you'll see that there's an option for Q&A and there's an option for multimedia viewer. So if you click on the Q&A, then you'll be able to see a window pop up on the right, and then you'll be able to type your questions via chat there. But you do need to make sure that you direct your questions to all panelists so everybody can see the questions. Now, I can't promise that we'll get through everybody's questions because our experience with these kinds of events is that we get quite a few, but we'll take as many as we can. And I also encourage you to engage with the panelists offline too, if you'd like to. And you can see on the screen in front of you, we've got everybody's Twitter handles by which you can do that. I also can't rule out that I may, as moderator, get a visit from Riley, the WMD program official cat, who during meetings does like to wander into shot sometimes and wander out again. But I've taken precautions in order to reduce that risk, and hopefully those risk reduction measures have worked this afternoon. So we're going to go to our panelists now, and we've asked each of our panelists if they can keep their responses fairly short. They'll probably each speak for 2 or 3 minutes on the first round, and then for slightly less time after that. But for Uli, you've written this very, very interesting chapter in the volume on looking at the Euro-Atlantic area and nuclear tensions there, and you've sort of coined this term of asymmetrical risk perceptions, which I found really interesting. And I wondered if you could sort of explain briefly what you mean by this, and how do nuclear armed states in this region, and I'm thinking there are 3 on the NATO side and then there's Russia, how can these nuclear armed states address these asymmetries and reduce risk? Over to you.
Thank you, John. First of all, thanks to UNIDIR for having me invited to participate in this great study, which I think is really a tremendous amount of work and brings forward the whole debate. Also, thanks to Izumi Nakamitsu, for Renata, John, Wilfred for having me. All right, so the asymmetric risk perceptions. First of all, let's start very simple. Risk perceptions are almost naturally asymmetric, not just in international relations, but between you and me, John. I perhaps perceive the recent conflict between India and China as differently than you do. So do states. States look at certain problems, they assess the risk, and they come to a conclusion, which usually means that there is some effect on policy here. Now, in the nuclear realm and in the Euro-Atlantic, that gets a bit more complicated because things get complicated because states look at the nuclear policies of their adversaries, and then they look at different levels. Let me give you an example. Russia looks to the United States at the strategic level and assesses that because the United States is pursuing missile defense again since 2002, this might be a risk to the Russian second strike capability. So Russia perceives a clear risk at the strategic level, whereas the United States might not perceive the risk that high on the strategic level, but at the same time it perceives risk at the regional level, particularly when it looks to its allies in Europe and thinks, what are the Russians doing in a post-INF world? what's happening with regards to the Baltic states and the conventional imbalance. So it clearly perceives risk here at the regional level much different than the United States does. So this is one of those classical asymmetries, and states or groupings of states like NATO have to deal with these asymmetries. Now the question is, what do we do with that? Usually I would say that huge asymmetries and risk perceptions are not a good starting point for states to start talking. And that's the first big point that I would like to make. That is, in order to address these asymmetries, states need to talk to each other. That does matter. The more symmetrical risk perceptions, the more incentives are on both sides to start talking to each other. We can talk about some of the examples later, like, for instance, misperceptions about Russian nuclear doctrines, the so-called escalate to de-escalate strategy, if there ever was one or if there ever is one. And at the same time, I would say the second point is states need to continue doing the positive things. And by positive things, I would list not just risk reduction, but arms control. There's not much left of arms control. I was struck by Renata's remark at the beginning that in 1982, one of the first study of UNIDIR was basically on risk reduction. Makes sense, because at that time, times were bad. Arms control was not in a good state. So again, today, states like to talk about risk reduction when arms control is in a bad state. So that means let's cling on to the last remains of arms control, like New START, and we can talk about this later, what that could mean for the years going forward.
Well, thanks, Uli. That's given us a lot to chew on, and I think this idea of asymmetrical perceptions is definitely an interesting one to keep in mind, I guess, as we're talking not only about the Euro-Atlantic area, but other parts of the world. And I'm also struck by something in your chapter, which you might unpack later on in the discussion, where you talk about nuclear deterrence policies as sort of the manipulation of risk. And I think that's quite an interesting way to think about it, particularly as we think about other parts of the world where there are tension too. And one of those regions of the world is Southern Asia, and I think that really clearly shows the interconnected nature of nuclear politics. You've got states who are seen as nuclear weapon states in the NPT, but you've got nuclear armed states who are not members of the NPT. And you've kind of got these nuclear chains of various kinds. And Manpreet, you've written about this in your chapter on the region. What are these nuclear chains, and what does this mean for the nuclear risk reduction agenda?
Thank you very much, John, and good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Thanks so much to the UNIDIR webinar format for getting me to use this opportunity to explain some of the thoughts I put in my chapter in the report which is being discussed today. Ulrich said that Euro-Atlantic is complicated. Well, wait till you get to Southern Asia and you realize how bad sometimes the things can be. So I put a subtitle to my chapter called The Chain Conundrum, because what I find in Southern Asia is that the nuclear activities, developments work out in the form of a nuclear chain, which comprises of 4 players. It starts with the US. What happens in the US filters down to China and then to India and to Pakistan. So what we have in the region are essentially 3 adversarial dyads that we are talking about. So there's US, China, there's China, India, and India, Pakistan. And none of them functions in a state of splendid isolation where they can be, disconnected with what is going on in some of the others. So what you have is a situation where the nuclear postures, force structures, capability buildup, doctrines, strategies of one tend to implicate on the other. And that's where the nuclear chain format, which actually, is completely different from how the NPT looks at nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. Now, there are 2 or 3 important features of this Southern Asian nuclear chain conundrum that I want to highlight. The first of which is that all of the 4 countries and the various dyads that we are talking about, the permutations, combinations that come up, have a different role for their nuclear weapons. So while Pakistan believes that it needs its nuclear weapons for conventional deterrence against India. India and China have rather similar nuclear approaches where they believe in a narrow role for their nuclear weapons, and they don't link up nuclear weapons for conventional contingencies in their strategic formulations. The US, on the other hand, in the latest nuclear posture review, is now talking about an expanded role of its nuclear weapons, which would also apply to cyber attacks or space attacks or large-scale conventional attacks as well. Secondly, the four countries are perched at different levels of nuclear capability. And this is exactly the point that Ulrich was making earlier about perception asymmetry. So the US has the most modern and the largest arsenal. China is modernizing fast. And its numbers, though, are far lesser than that of the US. They are still nearly double of what India and Pakistan have. So basically, the point I'm making is we are sitting at different perches of nuclear capability, including, for instance, Pakistan believing in the idea of tactical nuclear weapons, China now deploying MIRVed missiles, China and India deploying SSBNs. So each one, based on its own conception of what makes for credible deterrence, has been operationalizing its capability. And this makes for a difficult format in which you could do risk reduction because of the perception asymmetry. And lastly, the four have a different sense of nuclear risks. In fact, there is no sense of shared risks that you have amongst any of these four countries. Unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought that sense, that shared perception about risk, we don't have that in the region right now. In fact, in Southern Asia, I find Pakistan, for instance, likes to play up the nuclear risks because it believes that enhances its deterrence. China likes to play up nuclear ambiguity because it believes it enhances its nuclear deterrence versus the US. So therefore, each one is looking at the idea of risk very differently. Some are finding it beneficial, and there is no shared sense where they want to actually get rid of the nuclear risks. That understanding, I don't think, yet permeates this region. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Manpreet. There's a lot to chew on there, and I was really struck by what you were saying, that there's no sense of shared risk in Southern Asia, and I also, it leads me to wonder if there's a sense of shared risk in other tense regions of the world, which is maybe something we can come back to a little later in the discussion. But I know, Wilfred, you've been doing a lot of work in terms of trying to build a sort of a conceptual framework for thinking about this in a flexible way. And you produced this framework analysis in which you talked about doctrinal, escalatory, unauthorized, and accidental sort of pathways to nuclear use. And it seems from what Uli and Manpreet is saying is there are sort of implications here of these new developments for these doctrinal and escalatory pathways in particular. So I'm just sort of wondering, I mean, you've been looking across these different contexts, both as an author and also as an editor of this volume. What do you think are the practical risk reduction steps that are the most necessary right now, or indeed the most promising?
Thanks, John. So I think we have to start by recognizing that the tense environment we're currently in may actually increase the perceived value of nuclear weapons, right? And from a risk reduction perspective, it certainly presents obstacles to the most necessary, if drastic, actions under the wide umbrella of nuclear risk reduction. And we've talked a little bit about arms control and disarmament, but even things like the possibility for doctrinal changes, for revisiting modernization programs, and so forth. And so these are, quite difficult. And Manpreet points this out in her chapter. But risk reduction is necessary precisely because it's difficult, and we'll have to move forward in circumstances that are similar to those that have seen risk trend in the wrong direction. So this is kind of a caveat for recommendations. I don't think there's really any low-hanging fruit. In terms of what practical steps, I think for me, they fall into a couple of categories, and this echoes some of the comments that have already been made. I think the first is engagement. This week in Vienna, we've seen bilateral talks between the US and Russia on arms control, and I think that's certainly a good sign. The P5 the last couple of years has done a lot of work on nuclear doctrines, and at least based on the information they've shared with the public, there seems to be quite a bit of attention on strategic risk reduction. I think this sort of engagement is quite necessary to rebuild trust, to create these common understandings, and to reduce the asymmetries that Ulrich is talking about. It can also be a foundation for further dialogue, including on different strategic issues, including technological developments, John, which you write about in your chapter. But also, I think importantly, to involve different configurations of actors, including nuclear armed states outside the NPT, as well as nuclear allied states. And I think these have to be accounted for in terms of escalatory pathways, and also given the spread of technologies, conventional as well, that can impact on nuclear risk. The hope, I think, is that this kind of dialogue can eventually shift to negotiations, to policies of restraints or commitments and so forth. It's quite striking to me that across all chapters of the volume that this need for dialogue is really quite emphasized. And I think it points to the fact that there's no real panacea even at the regional level, right? You need kind of this basic building block to increase buy-in for everything else. The second category of practical action I would point to, and the High Representative mentioned this as well, is crisis communications. If engagement at the strategic level is about reducing misperception, misunderstanding, miscalculation, this is really, I think, the operational equivalent. Again, some of this is about building on what already exists to ensure the robustness of hotline systems. Ulrich writes about the implementation of incidences at sea accords and dangerous military activities agreements. There's a value in putting into place deconflicting hotlines to perhaps update or expand the purpose of risk reduction centers or associated pre-notification and warning agreements, especially given new systems of concern. I think these are kind of the steps that are a little bit more realistic in this environment because they're about dialogue, they're about information exchange without necessarily requiring restraint in behaviors or in capabilities. And they also focus, I think, on inadvertent escalation, which is a point of consensus among nuclear armed states. And certainly, I think the hope is that this can create the better relations that can get you to these other, perhaps more ambitious, you could say, but that's not the right word. But these other kind of risk reduction measures that we're looking at.
Thanks, Wilfred. Just a reminder to all of our attendees, you can use the chat function to put questions up. And I'm going to take one, I'm going to put one more round of questions to our panelists, and then we're going to look at our Mentimeter poll, and then we're going to go out to you folk to take some of your questions. Wilfred, I think you set things up very well in terms of, okay, at the sort of the conceptual level, the general level, you've said, look, there is no panacea. There need to be these general activities, but they need to be manifested in these specific concrete ways. Which sort of brings me back to you, Uli, and the Euro-Atlantic area. And, you know, a lot of this current focus on risk reduction has sort of been, it's been a discussion at the strategic level. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the US and Russia, a lot of talk about the US and China. But in your chapter, you were looking at some of the sort of more specific regional and sub-regional concerns. I mean, you were talking about the Baltics and the Black Sea as being two sort of geographical sub-regions of concern where there was a lot of tension and potential for escalation, whether deliberately or inadvertently. And of course, I mean, there are these broader concerns in a post-INF age in Europe about the reintroduction of intermediate nuclear missiles. And then lurking behind all of that, there's the ongoing controversy about the development of missile defenses on the NATO side. So kind of brings me to, if there were sort of three things that you could suggest in a concrete way in the Euro-Atlantic context, what would they be? I mean, to get the ball rolling in terms of risk reduction.
Thank you, John. That's perhaps the problem. because we're not running out of ideas to suggest since a couple of years. Wilfred set that nicely up when he talked, for instance, about the Inksy agreement between Russia and the Soviet Union, between the United States and Russia, or various types of confidence and security building measures, what we used to call low-hanging fruits. So those ones are not the low-hanging fruits anymore these days. They are high-hanging fruits. These days now we have moved to talk about risk reduction in the hope that at least, not just rhetorically, but that the sides would agree that there is a heightened risk because we don't want to talk, or we cannot talk about the confidence building measures anymore. And of course, we cannot talk about arms control anymore. So let's just be honest with ourselves and say that basically, when it comes to cooperatively dealing with security issues, we have basically hit rock bottom. We're not running out of good ideas. There are lots of good ideas around. The problem is, how do we get back to the point where the major actors start again talking to each other? You said it correctly, John. A lot is focusing, particularly these days, now with a meeting in Vienna on the strategic level between the United States and Russia and China, not at the table, but little flags are around at the table. But at the same time, I think that it's also those states that are at the hotspots, and you mentioned two: the Baltic sub-region, the Black Sea sub-region. Those states also have a certain responsibility with regards to their own security at the sub-regional level, but also with regards to larger security in Europe and the Euro-Atlantic region. And I'm not trying to get into a contest here with Manfred, but just look at the Black Sea region and see, you know, where Russia is secretly involved in a war in eastern Ukraine. You still get Russian troops stationed in a part of Moldova that is, where Transnistria says, no, we're not part of Moldova. You have Turkey, a major actor south of the region. You have the conflict in Syria with the involvement of Russia and other state actors, the employment of WMD in that conflict. So that's really a hotspot. So in that regard, yes, one of the ideas would, for instance, be a regional risk reduction center where those actors get a certain buy-in to take care of their own security. Another suggestion that we have recently started discussing in Hamburg amongst the group that I'm leading there is, for instance, the idea, what about those states that are part of NATO's active nuclear sharing arrangement, that are hosting nuclear weapons? Why not do those states have a certain responsibility with regards to risk reduction? I think they do. Why should we just leave the nuclear business to the nuclear armed states? Should those states perhaps, and here we're talking about Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, Turkey, do those states have an additional responsibility? Should they come up with their own ideas with regards to risk reduction measures? For instance, when it comes to transparency, but for instance, also with regard to declaratory policies and nuclear use, whereas NATO officially says there is no declaratory policy, but that would be an open question for me. Do those states have an additional responsibility here? So all I'm saying is, yes, extremely bad times right now for whatever you want to call it, risk reduction, CSDMs, arms control, but ownership is something that states have no matter where they sit, the large powers, middle powers, and the smaller ones.
Well, thanks very much. I think there are some pretty good concrete ideas there, despite the difficulty of the situation at the moment, which you outlined very well. Manpreet, I mean, if we look at a Southern Asian context, I guess the same question comes to my mind is what could be done in concrete terms. And I found it interesting in your introductory remarks, you focused on these three adversarial dyads, the India-Pakistan, India-China, and the US-China relationships. But there's a fourth one that you also talked about in your chapter, which is, of course, the dyad between Pakistan and China, which is one of a strategic partnership between the two countries. And I just wonder, I mean, would there be ways to leverage that partnership with a view to nuclear risk reduction in the Southern Asia region? Would that be a place to start? Are there concrete things that could come out of that, or does it need to start somewhere else? And what would those kind of initial kinds of risk reduction measures to get the ball rolling in concrete terms be? I mean, I know, for instance, India and Pakistan have long had some sort of hotline agreement, but it's not really clear how operational that agreement is. And with the strategic chain kind of situation where you've got a multipolarity, do you need more sophisticated kind of crisis communication channels? So what do you think?
Thanks, John. So I share the pessimism of my other panelists about the general geopolitical situation in the world. And Southern Asia is placed in the same context. So the situation doesn't look conducive for nuclear risk reduction. But as Wilfred reminded me from my own chapter, that it's precisely when the situation is so difficult that you need risk reduction, that you need mechanisms that would work in order to not have a crisis, run away with its own dynamics. I was quite struck by what Ms. Nakamitsu said earlier about lessons from COVID and how the generally, the globally destructive consequences that we are seeing of the novel coronavirus, that should hold up a mirror to nuclear risks as well, because we are going to see a similarly globally destructive nature in case any use of nuclear weapons was to happen. But the pandemic, instead of exposing our mutual vulnerability to each other, and instead of having raised our sensitivity to nuclear risks, by showing us what a leveler this would be, rather what we see today are trends which are moving towards more nationalism, more insular approaches, less engagement, and less receptivity to each other's concerns. And this is the difficult position in which we are having to think about nuclear risk reduction. But since we have to trudge along, the risks are growing, disarmament is not happening, and therefore this halfway house about reducing risks is, I think, where we have to sort of, chisel out some of the ideas. So my first idea, which is also of everyone, I think, in the book and in this panel, is initiation of strategic dialogues. I think talking to each other never harmed anyone. And it's very important for us to understand each other's doctrines and threat perceptions. Because right now, everyone is assuming the worst of the other. And therefore, we are in this situation. So initiation of dialogues in some form or the other, whether it's bilateral, multilateral, NPT, outside the NPT, wherever we can, I think initiation of dialogues is very important. Again, Ms. Nakamitsu pointed to about military to military, diplomatic, political, at whatever kinds that is possible. I would add to that to say, why not have retired SFC commanders, strategic force commanders of different countries, talk to each other in an informal track to kind of a dialogue where they share their experiences of how ineffective the nuclear weapons really are, and try to push that as a way of addressing some of the risks that they would have felt while they were in positions in strategic forces command across the world. Secondly, better utilization or institution of hotlines. John, you pointed out about how the hotlines sometimes do exist, but they don't get utilized. The trust factor here becomes very important. And crisis management channels which have been put in place during peacetime actually come in handy during crisis situations. Currently India and China, as everyone knows, are in a military face-off. And some of the crisis management channels that had been put into place from 1988, 1993 onwards are coming in useful, at least to get the militaries to talk to each other. So you have these simultaneous dialogues going on at the diplomatic as well as the military level. So therefore, better utilization of your communication, crisis management channels is extremely important. Thirdly, I have an idea about formalizing low alert levels. In Southern Asia, all of the three countries here don't have their nuclear force structures on high alert postures. Can we somehow, through coordinated moves, have a formalized, kind of an agreement on keeping them at low alert levels. And this will be particularly important as new technologies like hypersonics or artificial intelligence and command and control, which are going to compress your timelines for action. In those kinds of circumstances, this kind of a risk reduction measure would be very useful. I've suggested sharing best practices on nuclear safety and security in order to foster habits of engagement, in order to get people to talk about a common safety and a security culture, even if it's from the energy domain. I think that itself would help to build some kind of trusted channels of communication. At the multilateral level, I mean, we've spoken about how the NPT is a very useful format, but then the NPT has a handicap that it doesn't include all the nuclear armed states. So therefore, I was thinking about something like a nuclear risk reduction summit along the lines of what we had as the nuclear security summits, where you have this engagement at the highest political level in order to increase the awareness about the nuclear risks that we are dealing with. And just as we had the idea of gift baskets and these house gifts that countries could come with, that would be a useful format in order to understand and then to arrive at some collectively thought about nuclear risk reductions. And lastly, I want to flag education on nuclear risks. I don't think there is enough awareness about these nuclear risks. As I started by saying, different countries perceive them differently and believe that they can do escalation management. I think we have to get out of that mindset in order to accept mutual vulnerability to these risks and hence restraints on nuclear behavior. Because our destinies are interconnected. If nuclear use was to happen, even between two modestly equipped nuclear armed states, it's going to be a challenge for the entire world. And that interconnectedness of our destinies should be a part of the education that we do on awareness of nuclear risks. These are some of the thoughts I had.
Thanks, Manpreet. And as you were speaking, I was thinking of some of the work on the climate effects of the nuclear war by Alan Robock and Brian Toon and others, and precisely this value it's had in awareness raising about the global effects of even a limited nuclear conflict. And they were using the example of India and Pakistan, in fact, for that one. A couple of things strike me about this, and what you were saying about the idea of some sort of summit is an interesting one and a nice segue through to the question I was going to ask Wilfred, which in a way piggybacks off some of the remarks Izumi was making before about the NPT, and that is, we've got this NPT review cycle that's underway. It's got a postponed review conference that's we expect going to be in January. What happens after the NPT? What can be done to ensure that risk reduction is not only on the agenda, but it's actually going to lead to some sort of practical kind of outputs. So I just wonder what you think of that, Wilfred, including this idea of some sort of summit. The other thing that struck me too about this conversation that we've been having is, first of all, I mean, everybody's pretty pessimistic about the situation, but also, you're talking very much in terms of dialogue and these sort of softer voluntary measures. Is there still a place for legally binding sort of arms control measures? I mean, what is actually feasible, do you think? And this seems very important right now in an environment in which there's a lot of talk about New START, for instance. Will it have a future? And maybe that's a question worth considering, Wilfred, is, and maybe to the rest of the panel, is what's the risk reduction value of New START or its follow-on? So maybe, Wilfred, if you want to take the first question, if you have thoughts to offer on the second part, and the others have pursuits that they want to talk about to the leads.
Thanks, John. So yeah, I mean, risk and risk reduction have been on the agenda for quite a while, right? We're not necessarily reinventing the wheel. And in all likelihood, these issues are likely to persist, especially if conditions deteriorate. But I think there is something different about this conversation, this dialogue over the last few years about risk reduction. Both in terms of substance, I think it reflects quite contemporary risks at the multilateral level, with concerns expressed about how particular developments, including technologies, will impact future risks. And also in terms of the urgency and the high level of tension, we've talked about the P5 processes as well as the state-led initiative. So I think the question really is, how do we preserve these aspects? How do we preserve kind of this attention? Obviously, it's a matter of commitment. It's a matter of political will. But I also think it has to do fundamentally with how we think about nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon related systems. And so my suggestion is to kind of keep it on the agenda and to keep this momentum. One is I think there needs to be a constant process where a risk framing is deployed to developments in policies or capabilities. So as an example, Russia fairly recently issued a document of basic principles of its state policy on nuclear deterrence. And already there's a lot of really good analysis out there about what might this mean for the scope of circumstances in which Russia might consider the use of nuclear weapon use, including particularly against ballistic missile launches against Russia and its allies. I think these are the kind of questions we have to raise, especially in light of ballistic missile developments in the US or with NATO or with some of the testing that's going on. Another example, and a bit of a self-plug here, apologies for this, but how might changes in military operations linked to COVID impact not just deterrence operations, but safety and security of stockpiles to the maintenance, transfer, and control of nuclear weapons and systems? And I brought up some of these questions in an op-ed I penned recently for the European Leadership Network. But I think the point is that we need to kind of think about these sort of things not just from national security perspectives, but from the perspective of risk of any detonation event. And if the claim is that there is no risk from these developments for accidental use or unauthorized use, then the question is, why do we have that level of confidence? Why do nuclear armed states have that level of confidence? The second recommendation is kind of in conjunction with this, and I think it points to Manpreet's point about a summit in particular. But I think there's certainly more work done needed to produce or consider, especially what risk reduction recommendations are possible, especially in the context of these existing intergovernmental processes, but also to take forward this work at the regional and sub-regional levels. And certainly that's something that organizations such as NTI and BASIC have done some work on in the past, and UNIDIR will consider these kind of contextual elements. The value of these things is that it helps to diffuse the issue, right? It ensures wider engagement, which is quite significant in terms of maintaining the commitment and this political will. And in some ways, as the High Representative mentioned, I think the extension of this NPT review cycle can help this. But I do think that there is value in a kind of a standalone forum, whether it's a summit, an international conference dedicated to nuclear risk reduction. And I think this sort of venue will help employ the risk framing that we're talking about at a more systematic, in a more systematic manner.
Thanks very much, Wilfred. And that actually brings us, because the clock is ticking, to the second open-ended question that we have for our audience today, which I think fits very nicely with what all of you have just been saying, and that is, what risk reduction measures should states be prioritizing? What does our audience think? So you can use the multimedia viewer option that I described before, and you can enter your ideas there by using the rounder icon with the 3 breadcrumbs and then selecting multimedia viewer. We've got a lot of questions coming in just a few minutes to tackle them, so I'll ask you to keep your responses brief. But I just want to, while these are sort of coming in, I just want to throw out some more questions there. So it sounds like there needs to be the development of sort of a shared risk assessment. That seems to be what you're saying, Wilfred, you know, and Manpreet, through some sort of summit or process. I'm also hearing from all of you, at least you're implying it, that the escalatory pathway seems to be the one around which pretty much most experts, if not states, agree that's the one that's of real concern right now. So, you know, Wilfred's 4 pathways of doctrinal, escalatory, accidental, and unauthorized. It's this escalatory pathway that's of particular concern. Is that true to say? Is that sort of an element of building a shared risk assessment? Does anyone briefly want to come in on that? Uli?
I think Manpreet had her hand up.
Well, you go first, Uli, and
Okay.
then Manpreet.
Okay. So just a couple of quick remarks on this. Yes, ideally a shared risk assessment, that's what we would like to have. And yes, focusing on the escalation pathways makes sense. But then again, I do have the impression, and I tried to make that point in the chapter that I wrote for you guys, is that on both sides of the Atlantic, people are focusing on escalation pathways that are high impact, but actually low probability events. Let's just look at the debate that we're having within NATO. It constantly circles around the scenario, the day when Russia will grab a part of the Baltic and will then use coercively nuclear weapons to make NATO back down. Whereas at the same time, a large part of the debate in Moscow seems to circle around the question, what happens the day that the United States achieves almost complete invulnerability because it invests so much in its missile defense assets, and Russia will basically stand there with a completely devalued nuclear arsenal and just awaiting the bolt from the blue strike on Russia. I think it's correct to talk about these issues, sure, but let's not just focus on those. So escalation pathways, yes, but let's talk about those ones that would be high impact, but also at least medium sized to also a larger probability. And I think here we all in the institutes, in the academia, in the think tanks, but also state actors need to be cleverer. We need to come up with better analysis in that regard.
Well, that's. I'm just going to go to Manpreet next for her thoughts, but I'm just going to prime Wilfred with a couple of questions just to think about while Manpreet is speaking. And one is, I mean, we're having this discussion about these sort of risk reduction summits and things like that, which is, it sounds like that would be very useful. But of course, we do have a multilateral system in the UN. What could the UN do? I mean, it does groups of governmental experts, for instance. Would it be useful to have one on risk reduction? Would there be downsides to that? Back in 2016, there was an open-ended working group on taking forward multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations, and that led to the negotiations on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So are there sort of options there within the UN context that might be useful? Maybe, Wilfred, you want to say something there, and maybe what civil society or academia might contribute. But Manpreet, over to you first.
Thanks, John. In fact, on that, my thought is that we need to have a mock where you can approach. So it doesn't have to be one over the other. Where we can, if the UN gives us some, platforms where this is possible, let's grab them and use them. If we have to create more multilateral forums, let's do that. The NPT certainly does exist and should bring this up. So very inelegant expression, but mock where you can in order to, address some of these risks. On your question, John, earlier about legally binding nuclear arms control, I think that the appetite for those kinds of treaties is pretty low right now. And therefore, we have to start by, as Wilfred was saying, risk framing or raising awareness about the risks. Because I don't think there's an appetite amongst the nuclear arms states to go in for any legally binding formats right now. We might have to create the environment in order to get them to do that. So therefore, some soft measures, including even political statements, some things like what President Reagan and Gorbachev had then said about nuclear wars should not be fought because they can't be won and should not be fought. Something along those lines, some political statements that would bring down temperatures, that would, reduce the salience of nuclear weapons, which we are beginning to feel is so much more than what it used to be in the past. Addressing the issues at the regional level, Wilfred, I think given the nature of Southern Asia, it might not always be useful to do it at the regional level. I think given that the US becomes a factor in Southern Asia, it might have to be done at more than a regional level, whatever you want to, multilateral or global, whatever you want to call it, but it might have to be beyond that. In fact, John, if I may, I saw a question about would Indo-Pak bilateral nuclear arms control happen? Is it possible without China? And I think my answer to that is no, because with the kind of threat perceptions that India has with China, the kind of what we would build in terms of deterrence, which is credible against China, China will have to be an actor in any kind of arms control. There already are CBMs of some kinds which are existing between India and Pakistan. There is the non-attack on nuclear facilities. There is even an agreement on in case of an accident in nuclear weapons in any of the two countries. So some CBMs of some kind are already existing between India and Pakistan, but there is such a low trust between the two countries because of this repeated use of terrorism, cross-border terrorism between two nuclear armed states, again, something which is not seen anywhere else in the world. And because of, John, you had earlier asked about the strategic partnership between Pakistan and China, that in fact inhibits the possibility of arms control unless the three countries are involved in it in some form or the other. And China will not like to do it unless the US comes into the picture. And that's why I said it'll not be regional. The level will have to be raised to more than just regional when we look at arms control, risk reduction, CBMs in this region.
It's interesting, isn't it, Manpreet, that you're saying that the US would need to come into the picture for nuclear arms control in the Southern Asian region, and yet we have a situation in the Euro-Atlantic where the US would like to bring China in to arms control discussions on the successor to New START with the Russians, but China's not interested. Maybe there's a symmetry there. Maybe they could get together and talk to each other about how they might do some horse trading in that respect. If you're listening out there in Vienna. Uli, do you want to hop a suit?
Yeah, just let me add. I would even go as far and to say provocatively from a viewpoint of arms control, we have a situation in the Euro-Atlantic when I think about the Open Skies Treaty, where it would be helpful if the United States would not be such a negative arms control actor, meaning that we have a situation where other states could and should jump in to save at least part of the CSPM and arms control architecture.
Thanks. Good points, Uli. Wilfred, I threw a couple of questions at you before. We're coming to the end of our time, so I suspect that you could be our last or penultimate respondent. We'll see if we have time for another quick question or so after you've spoken, but over to you.
Thanks, John. I'll try to keep it short so we have room for a little bit more discussion. First, I wanted to talk about this, your question about shared risk assessment. And I think, yes, certainly, I think that's what we're aiming for. But I do want to clarify that just because you're talking about a shared risk assessment doesn't mean that you might necessarily address all of these issues, these asymmetries that exist. Rather, it's about identifying the sticking points and perhaps talking those out to get a sense of why those perspectives and why those risk assessments exist. And I think that is quite important in terms of the process itself. Regarding your broader question about particular processes, I mean, I suspect there are those in the audience that might be better suited than myself to answer some of these questions about the compatibility or the utility of some of these. That said, I do think that well, let me start by saying risk reduction is discussed already in quite a number of venues, including in the Conference on Disarmament, in the UNDC last year, obviously in the NPT as well. But if you're talking about things like the GGE or the OEWG process, sorry for all the acronyms, I think there are drawbacks and benefits to each one, and you have to deal with issues like the fact that you might be, for some nuclear weapon states under the NPT, they might not want to quote unquote, legitimize the nuclear armed states outside the NPT. Or when you're dealing with certain configurations of states, there are other, including regional, local kind of aspects that factor in here. And so I think the benefit of a risk reduction kind of summit or a dedicated forum is it operates in its own space, and you can have what Manpreet is talking about in this more security summit cooperative endeavor. And I think that is something that could be quite useful, and to maintain kind of the positive discussions about risk reduction.
Thanks very much, Wilfred. Now, if we can do this technically, I'm asking our producers if they're able to bring up again the background we had before with the Mentimeter, and it was showing the responses that people were giving on the risk reduction measures that they were suggesting states should prioritize. So I just wonder if my panel here would like to give a bit of a running commentary on this. So there are things in that sort of list that jump out at you as particularly good ideas or things that you haven't seen before?
I just saw doctrinal clarity that came up this last week. You know, Wilfred referred to when Russia was putting out for the first time publicly its deterrence or its statements on deterrence. Yes, I mean, let's face it, all those doctrines are deliberately ambiguous. A bit of more clarity would help. I've seen a lot of tea leaves of reading when it comes to escalate to de-escalate on the Russian side. At the same time, let's face it, if Russia would write in the doctrine, Russia does not have an escalate to de-escalate strategy and will never pursue one, I can tell you that there would be multiple panels that would say, you see, they deliberately said it so that we don't talk about it because they have it. So that's the problem about risk perceptions, and that's why I want to pick up what Manpreet said and what we tried to say over the last hour is people have to talk to each other. That's the only way where at some point you might come to the conclusion, yes, what he or she is saying is not just simply a lie, but that's what they really mean. But this is something, you know, you cannot just meet once, you need to meet multiple times and seriously engage with the other side. Otherwise, there is no value to that.
I'm reminded of the old expression that just because you're paranoid doesn't mean everybody's not out to get you. And the only way really is, as you say, you know, to have this dialogue. I also see that destabilizing technologies is coming up there quite a bit. That's sort of my baby, but I'm not going to pontificate on that. But I do know someone on the panel who's thought about this a lot. Manpreet, you've thought about that. And do you think that dialogue on these technologies would be a useful thing to do? And which technology would you start with very quickly?
Certainly, I think with the new technologies coming in, we don't even understand how they're going to intersect with nuclear deterrence. So a dialogue on that would certainly be extremely helpful. And I think to start with, I would give my vote both to hypersonics as well as artificial intelligence. Both of them need to be better understood in order to, to risk reduction. But if I may pick my own, John, out of this, which has been coming on, I saw the one on commitment to no first use strategies. And I think that is particularly useful as a risk reduction measure, and also to tie in with the first question that had come in about nuclear weapons disarmament and what should be on the priority agenda of nuclear disarmament. And I think a no first use commitment that can be universal amongst the nuclear armed states would be very useful. This would reduce the salience of nuclear weapons. It would reduce deterrence requirements. So the offense defense spiral that we are facing will be reduced. It would reduce the use or lose dilemmas that different countries have, which leads to perceptions of this kind. And it would push the world towards more sanity, more sobering down of temperatures that we all want. And John, just in one sentence, if I can answer a question which was about what role can NGOs play in this? So I think they occupy a very useful space. Unfortunately, they've had a limited impact on the political, on shaping the political will of the leaders who really have to take the first steps in this direction. I would want the NGOs to occupy this space in a more constructive fashion rather than becoming adversarial to the governments, because then they get shunned out of the picture and they're not able to have the impact, because the NGOs can play a very important role in raising awareness about this, in putting this into popular imagination, which is something which is missing. And therefore, we've all been talking about how risk reduction through understanding at the popular level is so important. Thanks,
Thanks, Manpreet. I'm going to give you the last word, Wilfred, before I wrap up.
Just really quickly, I saw the comments on the Mentimeter about unilateral steps, and I wanted to comment on that because, we've been talking about risk reduction as primarily this multilateral endeavor, and I think that's certainly the case. But I think the history shows that some of the most significant, whether it's risk reduction or arms control, disarmament steps have been taken unilaterally, including such as the presidential nuclear initiatives. So I think I would just encourage all of us to think, it really is, risk reduction is about these steps at all levels across all different activities and of all types. So.
Well, thanks very much. That's a good way to bring things to a close, Wilfred. Look, I want to thank all of our panelists today. Thank you so much. And I also want to thank our event producers, Tom Hickey and Letitia Zarkan. They've been our two graduate professionals on the WMD program for the last 6 months. They've done a great job under very trying conditions during the COVID pandemic. I think they've spent, both of them, a lot more time alone in their dwellings than they would like to as young folks, but they've done a fantastic job and we thank them. I also, again, want to thank the funders of UNIDIR's risk reduction work, Australia, Finland, Sweden, and Switzerland. And I also want to thank you, the audience, for your engagement and for your questions today and your inputs. In the next day or so, we'll be emailing to all registrants a feedback form. So please take a moment to fill that out and send that to us. It helps us improve our events. And I also want to point out that UNIDIR's work on risk reduction, but on WMD and nuclear arms control and disarmament in particular, is ongoing. There's going to be more work on all of these fronts in coming months, so stay tuned. We earlier had a link to the Risk Reduction Pathways publication, in which you can find chapters by all of the panelists, and wonderful chapters they are too, as well as great chapters by other folks, including Hassam Al-Dabimi and Tanya Ogilvie-White and so forth. You'll be able to check those out. And the Institute's also doing quite a bit of work in some of the other areas that were mentioned today. For instance, Manpreet mentioned artificial intelligence. Our colleagues on the SecTech program are doing a lot of work there. Hypersonic weapons, counter space, missile defenses, these are all areas in which we are thinking and writing about. And our latest publications page, you'll find some great stuff there, including a paper coming out before the end of the month by Paul Meyer on the nexus between counter space, missile defenses, and the global strategic balance. So check that out. And thank you very much once again. And everybody in New Delhi, in Hamburg, in New York, in Geneva, or wherever you are, have a wonderful evening and or an afternoon, depending. And we'll see you at the next UNIDIR event. Thanks once again from all of us.